Virgo, the news that changes everything doesn't always arrive from outside. That's the thing nobody prepares you for. You wait for it from other people, a conversation, a revelation, something said or discovered that reorganizes your understanding of the situation, and sometimes it does come that way. Sometimes the thing that shifts everything is external, something you hear, something you see, something that lands from outside you with enough force to make the before and after visible. But the news that changes everything most deeply, the kind that reaches the places that external things can't always reach, that one comes from inside. It surfaces slowly, usually over days or weeks or sometimes years of being almost known, almost faced, almost allowed to be fully real. It builds underneath the surface of how you've been managing things, underneath the routine and the performance and the daily decisions to keep going in the direction you've been going. And then one day, in a moment that looks ordinary from the outside, it comes all the way up. And, you know, not for the first time, but for the first time in a way you can't manage back down. And that moment, that specific, quiet, enormously significant moment is what you've been approaching, maybe for a while. Maybe you felt it getting closer without knowing exactly what it was. The particular quality of certain days lately, the specific weight in the chest that arrives in the quiet moments, the thought that surfaces and then gets managed away and then surfaces again, the knowing that you've been giving just enough attention to keep it from being fully silent, but not enough to let it be fully heard. Tonight it wants to be heard. So let's start with what you've been carrying. Not the obvious things, the things you'd name if someone asked you directly how you're doing. The other things, the ones underneath. The ones that exist in the honest part of you that only speaks when everything else goes quiet. The things you've been maintaining through effort, through habit, through the specific daily discipline of not looking at them directly that you've known somewhere in the body, haven't been right for longer than you've been willing to say. There's something in your life right now, maybe a relationship, maybe a situation, maybe a version of yourself you've been performing that you've been holding together past the point where holding it together still makes sense. Not because you're weak, not because you're unaware, but because the alternative to holding it together, the moment where you stop, where you let it be what it actually is rather than what you've been willing it to be, that alternative has felt too large, too disruptive, too much of a reorganization of everything that currently exists around this thing you've been maintaining. Um, and so you've kept going, kept adjusting, kept finding new ways to make something work that has been telling you in the specific language of how it feels in the body that it isn't working, kept interpreting the signals in the most generous possible direction, kept giving the benefit of the doubt past the point where the doubt deserved benefit, kept investing in something that has been returning less than it costs financially, emotionally, energetically, in the specific currency of who you are when you're organized around it versus who you are when you're not. And the weight of that maintaining, of keeping something alive that wants to be looked at honestly, has been accumulating in ways you may not have been fully tracking. In the tiredness that doesn't go away after rest, in the low grade tension that's become so familiar you've stopped feeling it as tension, in the specific quality of your days when you're alone with yourself and there's nothing between you and the honest version of where things are. That weight is the news. That's what's been trying to surface, not as a judgment of you, not as evidence that you did something wrong or that you should have known sooner or that you wasted something that can't be recovered, but as information, The clearest, most honest, most body felt information you have about what's true in your life right now and what needs to change. Now, here's what happens when that information finally gets fully heard. When the thing that's been circling finally stops circling and lands. When the knowing that's been almost known becomes completely, unavoidably, finally known. The tears, if they come, and they aren't weakness, they aren't breakdown. They aren't evidence that you can't handle this or that you're too affected or that something is wrong with how you're processing. They're recognition, physical, involuntary, completely honest recognition, the body's response to something true, making full contact with something real, to the managed surface finally opening enough to let the actual thing through, to the gap between the version of things you've been maintaining and the version that's actually true, finally closing in one moment, in one wave of feeling completely, and that closing, that specific, painful, necessary closing of the gap between what you've been saying and what you've been feeling is the beginning of something, not the end, the beginning. The first moment of the honest version, the first second of the after, the one where, finally, completely, without the management running on top of it, what's true. Let's talk about what you've been saying, not out loud necessarily, maybe not to anyone else, but internally, the specific story you've been telling yourself about why it makes sense to continue, why the timing isn't right to change things, why there's a version of this that works if you just adjust a little more, wait a little longer, try a little differently. The story that has kept the maintaining going past the point where the body started signaling that the maintaining was costing more than it was giving, that story is built from real things, from actual investment, time, energy, emotion, the specific parts of yourself you gave to this situation that can't be taken back, from the legitimate hope that things could be different, from the real moments, and there probably were real moments where this thing that isn't working gave you something that felt like what you needed, from the fear, genuine, legitimate fear of what the honest version of this looks like once you stop maintaining the alternative. And those things, the investment, the hope, the real moments, the fear, they deserve to be acknowledged. They're not delusions. They're not evidence of stupidity or naivety or a failure to see clearly. They're what happens when you care about something. When you're genuinely invested, when you've built your daily reality around something and the prospect of that reality changing, even if the changing would ultimately be better, produces the specific resistance of someone who knows that change, even necessary change, costs something real in the transition. But here's what the story has been doing alongside giving you reasons to continue that's worth seeing clearly now. It's been keeping you in the gap, that specific, suspended, exhausting gap between what you know and what you're willing to act on, between the honest version of the situation and the maintained version, between the news and the acknowledgement of it, and living in that gap, as familiar as it has become, has its own cost, separate from the cost of the situation itself. The energy of maintaining the story on top of the knowing, the specific tiredness of a person who knows something they're not yet ready to fully know, and something in you is ready now. That's why this is surfacing tonight in the particular way it is. Not because the timing is convenient, it probably isn't. Not because everything is in place, it probably isn't. Not because you've worked through all the fear and the grief and the resistance, you probably haven't. But because the weight of the not fully knowing has finally exceeded the weight of the knowing. Because the maintaining has finally cost more than the alternative. because the part of you that has been patient, that has given this situation every benefit and every generous interpretation and every additional chance, has finally, quietly arrived at the end of its patience. And that arrival, the end of the patience with the not knowing, is the news. That's what changes everything. Not a dramatic external event, not something that happens to you from outside, but this. The internal shift from almost knowing to fully knowing, from maintaining the alternative to letting the honest version be real, from the managed gap to the closed one. Now, here's what happens in the body when that shift completes, when the gap closes, when the knowing is finally, fully allowed to be known. Relief. Underneath whatever else is there, underneath the grief, the fear, the practical anxiety of what now there's relief, quiet, almost guilty, but real. The specific physical release of something that has been held in suspension, finally being allowed to settle, of the energy that was going into the maintaining the daily, constant, mostly invisible energy of keeping the story going, on top of the knowing, being freed from that task, of being, for the first time in however long this has been, building in the same place as the truth. That relief is important. Notice it. Even if it's underneath harder things, even if it's quieter than the grief or the fear, it's there and it means something. It means the honest version, however difficult, is lighter than the maintained one. That knowing, even when what's known is hard, is less exhausting than the almost knowing. That being in the same place as the truth finally, completely, is a kind of rest that the maintaining never allowed. And then the grief, because something is ending or changing or being seen clearly in a way that makes it impossible to continue as it was. And endings, even necessary ones, even ones that are right, even ones that were always coming, deserve grief. Not performance of grief, not the managed processing of loss through the lens of silver linings and lessons learned and everything happening for reasons, just the actual human specific grief of something that mattered to you not being what you needed it to be, of the version you hoped for not having been available, of the time and energy and heart that went into something that couldn't give back what was put in. That grief is real. It doesn't need to be hurried. It doesn't need to be immediately contextualized or assigned meaning or converted into growth. It just needs to be felt, honestly, completely, without the management system interceding to make it more bearable before it's been fully allowed to be what it is. Because grief that's managed before it's felt doesn't resolve. It waits. It goes underground the same way the knowing went underground. And then it surfaces later in unexpected moments, in disproportionate responses to small things, in the specific heaviness that belongs to something unfinished, and it asks again to be felt. And you go through the managing again, and it waits again until you finally stop and feel it completely, the way it always needed to be felt. So feel it now. If the tears come, let them come. If the weight gets heavier before it gets lighter, let it. If the honest version of this is more difficult than the maintained version ever was, let it be difficult. Not indefinitely, not without the understanding that this too moves through, but fully in the moment, without the management running on top of it for just a little while. Because on the other side of the feeling, on the other side of the grief being actually felt rather than managed, is something you haven't had access to in however long this has been building. Clarity, the specific, clean, unobstructed clarity of someone who is no longer spending energy on the maintenance of something that isn't true, who is no longer organizing their perception around a version of things that requires constant upkeep, who is in the same place as the honest version of their life and can therefore finally actually see it. And from that clarity, from that new, honest, unmanaged vantage point, decisions become possible that weren't before. Not because the circumstances necessarily changed, but because you did. Because the filter through which you were seeing everything, the one built from the maintaining, from the story, from the energy of keeping the gap open, lifted, and what you can see now from this new place is different from what was visible before. What you actually need becomes clearer. What you've been settling for becomes harder to unsee. What's actually available to you, what's been available all along, outside the frame of what you were maintaining, becomes more visible, more real, more accessible than it was when you were organized around something else. And the people and situations and possibilities that belong to the honest version of your life, the ones that fit who you actually are, rather than the version of you that was shaped around what you've been maintaining, those start to come into focus. Not immediately, not all at once, but gradually, as the energy that was going into the gap gets reclaimed, as the part of you that was organized around the maintenance comes back to yourself, as you become slowly, non-linearly, in the specific way that real change actually happens, the version of yourself that exists after the news, the version that knows fully, completely, without the management. And that version, the one on the other side of this, has access to things the maintaining version didn't, has access to the full range of what's possible for you, has access to the relationships and work and version of daily life that fit who you actually are when you're not spending your energy on keeping something going that was always going to have to end here, because it was always going to end here. Not as punishment, not because something went wrong, but because things that aren't true eventually stop being maintainable. Eventually the cost exceeds the capacity. Eventually the knowing can't be kept underground. Eventually the news arrives in whatever ordinary moment it chooses, and it's finally completely heard. You've survived every difficult thing that has come before this. Every moment that felt unsurvivable before it happened turned out to be survivable after it did. Every version of your life that ended opened into the next version imperfectly, non-linearly, with real grief in the transition, but opened. Every truth that felt too large to face turned out, once faced, to be something you could carry, something you were capable of moving through, something that asked more of you than felt fair, but didn't ask more than you had. This is the same, different in its specifics, in its particular weight, in the exact shape of what's changing and what it costs and what it requires of you in the days ahead, but the same in the essential thing, in the fact that you have what it takes to move through it, that you've been building in every difficult thing. You've already survived exactly the capacity this moment needs. The news has arrived. The real one, the internal one, the one that changes everything, not because it destroys anything, but because it finally makes the honest version of your life available. The one that fits who you actually are. The one that doesn't require the maintaining. The one that exists on the other side of the gap finally being closed. You know what it is. You've known for a while, and now, fully, completely, without the management running on top of it, you're letting yourself know it. That's the beginning, not the end. The beginning of the honest version, the one that was always waiting on the other side of the knowing. for you to finally arrive. You're here now, in the honest place, and everything changes from here.